menyatakan kemerdekaan Indonesia.
Kolonialisme is een onderwerp dat mij als schrijver niet loslaat. Na mijn boek over de geschiedenis van Congo werd mij in Nederland vaak gevraagd: maar waarom schrijf je niet over de dekolonisatie van Indonesië? Ik, als Belg? Tja, waarom niet? Juist als Belg kan ik wegblijven van het idee dat dit alleen een Nederlands-Indonesisch verhaal is. Het is wereldgeschiedenis en daarmee ook mijn geschiedenis. Misschien kan ik eindelijk de ramen een beetje openzetten en een ander verhaal vertellen door het perspectief wat te kantelen. Maar ik moet snel zijn nu de laatste getuigen nog in leven zijn.
Amerika, die komen bij boot, bij vrouw.
En zo begint dit avontuur. Op reis in de landen die met deze geschiedenis verbonden zijn en in mijn hoofd, waar een nieuw boek zich vormt.
Het is toch geen straf, hè? Literaire non-fictie.
Pak, bagaimana?
Bangsa Indonesia dengan ini menyatakan kemerdekaan Indonesia.
Kolonialisme is een onderwerp dat mij als schrijver niet loslaat. Na mijn boek over de geschiedenis van Congo werd mij in Nederland vaak gevraagd: maar waarom schrijf je niet over de dekolonisatie van Indonesië? Ik, als Belg? Tja, waarom niet? Juist als Belg kan ik wegblijven van het idee dat dit alleen een Nederlands-Indonesisch verhaal is. Het is wereldgeschiedenis en daarmee ook mijn geschiedenis. Misschien kan ik eindelijk de ramen een beetje openzetten en een ander verhaal vertellen door het perspectief wat te kantelen. Maar ik moet snel zijn nu de laatste getuigen nog in leven zijn.
Amerika, die komen bij boot, bij vrouw.
En zo begint dit avontuur. Op reis in de landen die met deze geschiedenis verbonden zijn en in mijn hoofd, waar een nieuw boek zich vormt.
Het is toch geen straf, hè? Literaire non-fictie.
saya punya satu mimpi Pak, bagaimana kita bisa mengembangkan book club di Indonesia ya.
Inilah Endgame. Halo teman-teman, hari ini kita kedatangan Yudo Suiji selaku co-founder dari Periplus Indonesia. Mas Yudo, terima kasih bisa hadir di acara kita.
Saya yang terima kasih, suatu kebanggaan buat kami, buat saya bisa hadir dalam Endgame, bisa ketemu dengan Pak Gita. Sungguh suatu kesempatan yang
Amin, amin.
jarang sekali.
Saya ini salah satu penggemar, pengunjung, dan konsumen di Periplus yang cukup setia selama puluhan tahun terakhir ini.
Terima kasih Pak.
Saya mau ada 130-an juta buku. Kalau kita minta masing-masing dari 280 juta manusia yang ada di Indonesia untuk baca setengah buku aja. Jadi 2 orang di Indonesia baca 1 buku.
Udah habis Pak.
Selesai kan?
Selesai.
Terus kita minta setiap orang di Indonesia untuk bercerita satu sama lain. Seluruh kebijaksanaan, seluruh wisdom, seluruh ilmu pengetahuan itu sudah terbaca. Ya kan? Dan oke lah, mungkin ada orang yang bisa baca setengah buku dalam 20 menit, tapi ada orang lain di Indonesia yang mungkin perlu 2 bulan. Nggak apa-apa, kita tunggu aja 6 bulan. Tapi kita targetkan dalam 6 bulan, seluruh warga, termasuk bayi di Indonesia, itu udah baca setengah buku. Oke lah, kita bisa simplifikasi yang dewasa, yang udah bisa baca buku. Anggaplah 150 sampai 200 juta yang udah mampu baca, ya udah kita tugasin aja. Masing-masing baca 1 buku. Selesai tuh. Iya kan?
Betul.
Keren kan?
Keren banget. Bagaimana Pak menggerakkannya ya?
Ya, saya sih di
setuju.
platform ini atau dimanapun kalau saya diberi kesempatan untuk berbicara, saya berupaya semaksimal mungkin untuk mengedepankan budaya baca buku. Mau digital atau non-digital terserah. Kalau saya, jujur, saya nggak bisa baca kalau nggak megang kertas. Jadi hanya bisa masuk otak kalau saya megang hard copies.
Itu menarik tuh Pak.
Saya udah coba Kindle berapa kali. Aduh, beda. Otak saya kayak slow down. Tapi kalau saya megang kertas kayaknya lebih jadi itu barang.
Tapi memang banyak yang mengatakan feelingnya seperti Pak kita katakan berbeda. Kita berada di sepertiga buku atau di seperempat buku atau di akhir buku.
Psikologinya beda.
Psikologinya beda. Kalau di tablet kan dia cuma merasa sama aja di satu lembar ini.
Betul.
Nah itu yang mengatakan kita akan lebih cepat membaca di Kindle atau di tablet dibandingkan dengan physical, tapi apa yang terekam di memori kita itu akan lebih lama dan lebih teringat dalam buku-buku yang physical. Makanya buku fisik itu terus trennya membaik. Memang juga saya punya satu mimpi Pak, bagaimana kita bisa mengembangkan book club di Indonesia ya. Ya seperti kita lihat Oprah Winfrey. Ya bagaimana book clubnya itu luar biasa. Tapi memang itu perlu suatu kedisiplinan waktu, ketelatenan, dan ya keterbukaan juga. Itu juga menarik kalau kita bisa. Ya Periplus juga terbuka. Kalau ada yang ingin membuat book club, ayo kita kembangkan bersama. Beberapa tokoh nasional itu juga sudah, Yudo ayo kita bikin. Ada yang sudah memulai 1-2 kali, 1 bulan sekali saja. Tapi topik-topiknya kita juga harus lebih terbuka. Bukan hanya di marketing atau di manajemen aja. Tapi juga kita juga ngambil topik-topik yang lain. Saya kira ini juga salah satu trigger untuk membuat orang juga membaca dan juga membuat orang juga setelah membaca juga saya juga ingin menulis ya. Kayaknya saya juga bisa ini membuat seperti itu.
Pasti.
Saya kira book club ini ya mungkin mulai kita galakan melalui online maupun offline.
Saya siap ikut
Ayo Pak,
kalau Anda mau
mulai
bikin.
1-2 dengan Pak Gita.
Iya, tapi dengan keterbatasannya. Yang pasti
Ya
waktu.
mungkin dengan sebagian dengan online, nggak perlu offline seperti ini.
Iya,
Tapi dengan online pun itu akan menarik sekali.
iya. Ini menarik sekali. Gitu.
Terima kasih Pak.
Agak-agak beda dengan apa yang ngobrolin sama orang-orang. Tapi nggak apa-apa, kita mulai
Iya.
di suatu tempat. Yang penting kita jelas lah ke depan nih untuk kepentingan yang
Dan saya yakin Indonesia pasti bisa dengan ya step by step kita memulai, walaupun kita tertinggal, tapi kalau bisa kita apalagi nanti dibantu dengan beberapa policy dari pemerintah ataupun pemerintah daerah yang mulai membuka, memudahkan.
Teman-teman, itulah Yudo Suwiji, co-founder dari Periplus Indonesia. Terima kasih. Inilah Endgame.
Hello everyone, welcome to Periplus Virtual Book Discussion, Indonesian Revolution with David van Reybrouck. I'm Tika, and I'll be your host for this event. We're so happy to have you guys join us this evening, but before we get started, allow me to go over some important rules for today's webinar. First, please keep your microphones muted throughout the discussion to avoid any background noise or interruptions. And second, if you have any questions, our team will drop a Google Form link at the chat box. You can feel free to drop them, any burning questions in the Google Form. We'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of the session with our moderator and also our speakers. Our panelists will answer as many as possible, so feel free to drop questions as many as possible as well. We encourage you to use the chat function to share your thoughts or comments or anything throughout the discussion, but please be respectful and considerate of others. Just a little bit of spoiler. We also have raffles for top questions at the end of this session. There are some e-voucher from Periplus. So we suggest you to type your questions after the discussion or during the discussion in the Google form. So our team will pick lucky questions for the e-vouchers. Is it 1, 2, 3? That depends on the enthusiasm. Let's see if you're lucky. Okay. We have for the chat box, also you can also feel free to introduce yourself. Say you can share your name, where you're from, or if you don't mind, you can also share your social media account and let's be friends. Mutualan. Right, so these are just a few guidelines to ensure that everyone has a positive and productive virtual book discussion experience today. And in this virtual stage, we already have our author, David van Reybrouck, and our moderator, Kak Olivia Hateem, to dive deep the Revolusi. So this is the book that we're going to discuss today. David is an acclaimed Belgian author, historian, and cultural critic. His book, Revolusi, sheds light on Indonesia's journey towards independence and its global impact, especially modern days, capturing the essence of pivotal moment in history. We are also honored to have with us Olivia Hateem, who will be moderating the discussion today. Kak Olivia is a respected figure in the literary community, known for her insightful perspectives and engaging interview style. Kak Olivia Hateem is also a reader who sometimes writes. She has published her debut novel titled Search. Now, Olive is also a general manager of Forward Library. Have you been there? It's really cool library in Sojokoro area. Okay, before we dive into the discussion, let me briefly introduce the book, Revolusi, Indonesia and the Birth of the Modern World. It offers a unique narrative of Indonesia's struggle for independence from colonial rule It also highlights the broader implications of Indonesia's revolution on the global stage. It makes it a must-read for everyone, especially if you're interested in history. Maybe you already have done before in elementary school, but trust me, this one is different because it's so narrative. And also if you're interested to politics and international relations, go for it. Because today we have this rare opportunity to hear from the author himself and gain deeper insights into his work. Without further ado, let's get started with our main event. Please join me in welcoming David van Reybrouck and our moderator for today, Olivia Hateem.
Thank you so much, Katika, for the warm introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's really great to see so many familiar names and faces joining us tonight. I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion on Revolusi by David van Reybrouck. My name is Olivia Hateem, and I'm truly excited to be your moderator for this session. Before we dive in, just a quick reminder that we will have a Q&A session later, so feel free to take notes, to jot down any questions that probably come to mind as we go along. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our esteemed author, David van Reybrouck. David is not only an award-winning author, but also a historian and archaeologist who has made significant contributions to our understanding of and democracy. His work includes Congo, the epic history of a people, which offers a comprehensive history of the Congo, blending personal narratives with broader historical events, and Against Elections, the case for democracy, where he critically examines modern democratic systems and proposes innovative alternatives. For those of you who are curious and want to explore more, both Congo and Against Elections are available at Periplus, so you can check them out and purchase them directly. His latest work, Revolusi, which we will be discussing about, takes us on a deep journey through Indonesia's path to independence, shedding light on stories and perspectives that often go unheard. I have the book here with me. It's a really heavy book, but I wouldn't say it's a heavy read because David's narratives are pretty easy to understand, I would say. And I have to be honest, I haven't fully delved into every part of it yet. I've only been able to read certain sections in depth and skim through the rest. There are quite a few things that I'm already familiar with from history lessons or other books I've read, but there is so much more that I had never come across before. So I'm really excited to dive deeper into this discussion with all of you guys today. Revolusi was originally published in Dutch under the title Revolusi, Indonesia and Het Ontstaan van de Moderne Wereld. The book's impact has been so profound that it's been translated into English, allowing a broader audience, including all of us here, to engage with Indonesia's rich history. David's work really challenges that old saying, history is written by the victors. In Revolusi, he doesn't just focus on the years between 1945 and 1949, the years when Indonesia's independence was declared. 1945 in Indonesia, and 1949 after military aggressions and agreements that were officially recognized by the Dutch. He takes us way back to the early 17th century when Dutch traders first arrived in the Indonesian archipelago. The book introduces us to dozens, even hundreds of names that might be unfamiliar to many Indonesians because they don't appear in our history textbooks. It's a powerful reminder that the independence of a nation is often built on the lives of countless individuals whose names we may never know, those anonymous figures who play such crucial roles in the creation of the Republic of Indonesia. During the launch of the Dutch version of Revolusi in 2020, Pak Goenawan Mohamad noted how both the Dutch and Indonesians often hesitate to discuss the revolution. How for the Dutch it's associated with violence, and for Indonesians, most of us, it's often seen as a myth. And through this book, David van Reybrouck invites us to reconsider this period, not as a distant myth, but as a significant chapter in the formation of Indonesia's national identity. And tonight, a day before August 17th in Indonesia, is the perfect time for us to continue or even begin to revisit the conversation about the revolution, about independence, and what it really means for us and for our nation. Joining us to enrich this discussion, we have a distinguished panel of experts. First, we have Mbak Ayu Utami, an acclaimed author and one of the most influential voices in Indonesian literature. Mbak Ayu's work often challenges societal norms, and we are excited to hear her thoughts on the themes explored in Revolusi. Our second panelist would be Mbak Irine Gayatri, a renowned scholar and historian whose research has significantly contributed to our understanding of Indonesia's political and social history. Her expertise will also provide valuable context to our conversation. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to invite David to join us. David, are you with us?
I think I am. Can you hear
Oh.
me, Olive?
Hello, David. Who had met you?
Thank you so much. I'm still on holiday. I'm on the French countryside.
Oh.
It's afternoon. It's very sunny. That's why I closed the curtains just to have a better visual. Thank you so much for this great introduction. I think you should fill the next 2 hours. You do a much better job than I could do.
It's great to have you here. Thanks for taking the time to be with us. I imagine your schedule has been quite busy with all the attention Revolusi has been getting. How has the response been so far?
Oh, I've been working on this book for almost 6 years. And you know, when you're writing a book, you're so focused. You're a writer yourself as well. And then all of a sudden, this book comes out. First, it came out in Dutch, as you said. I'm not Dutch myself. I'm Belgian, this a neighboring country. And the book was received extremely well in the Netherlands. Some critical voices as well, which I think is good. But now the book is going through a number of translations, and it's really interesting to see. You know, I was in Finland a few months ago. In Finland, I mean, they don't have any connection with Indonesia, you know, in the direct sense. But people were really interested to hear about it because it's the beginning of the entire decolonization movement. And now the book has been available in English. We're going to talk about this. And an Indonesian translation is underway. I think that's very important. It's Gramedia who is going to publish it. They're working on it right now. And if all goes well, it should be published next year in Indonesian.
Oh my God, we're so happy to hear that. Also, I'm curious what it's like to see your work resonate with audiences in so many different countries, especially now that Revolusi is available in multiple languages.
Well, obviously, the first big wave of feedback came from the Netherlands, where the comment I heard most often was, how come we didn't know about this? How come we, the Dutch, are so ignorant? Somebody once said, like, I'm angry against my history teacher. He never told me about this. After the book came out, I had a theater tour in the Netherlands where I was on stage telling the story of the book. And many people came along. I think I once calculated 25,000 people, which it's a lot of people to, you know, at different cities and different audiences. But that was the reaction I heard most often. There's been in Holland an uneasiness to talk. I think what Goenawan Mohamad said is quite right. There's an uneasiness. There's been a long silence to talk about Indonesia and especially about the Revolusi because it felt uneasy. The veterans who were still alive felt that they were not appreciated. They felt they were accused of wrongdoings. And then people said, like, but we should talk about it more openly. So it was quite controversial. And I think the book, and together with the next exhibition at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and a couple of books and studies that were commanded by the Dutch government. So last couple of years, there's been an incredible acceleration in the Netherlands coming to terms with its colonial past. It has taken a very long time, but now it's out on the open and the debate is there, and my book plays its role within that broader debate.
Oh my God. I think it's not only for the Dutch, but also for Indonesians. I think most of us also don't really know the real history that we've passed through in the past. Could you start by sharing with us the key messages you wanted to convey through Revolusi? Like, what motivated you to write this book, and what do you hope readers take away from it?
Yeah, I think the central message of the book is that the Indonesian Revolusi was more than just national history. It was more than just colonial history. It was global history. And I say this emphatically because we have a tendency to look at colonial histories. There's been a growing interest for colonial histories, especially among former colonizing states over the past 10, 15 years. But there's something that I find a little bit problematic. Every country seems to be dealing with its own with its biggest colony. Belgium with Congo, Britain with India, France with Algeria. They had many more, but it's Algeria. Germany with Namibia, and the Netherlands with Indonesia. And so it seems as if colonial history is only remembered today as national history. The Revolusi was important for Indonesia, of course, and it was important to the Netherlands, but it's unrelated to events elsewhere in the world. And that's why the subtitle of the book is important. It's Revolusi, Indonesia and the Birth of the Modern World. Because you see that Indonesian is more than just national and colonial history. It was the very first country to declare its independence after World War II, just 2 days, August 17, tomorrow, 2 days after the end of World War II. So they were the first. Things were happening elsewhere as well, in the Philippines and India. But then, critically, Sukarno organized 10 years later the Bandung Conference, which was really made to inspire the rest of the colonized world to take lessons from what had happened in Indonesia. So there's not only just the the vertical dynamic between the metropole in the north and the colony in the south. There's also a horizontal dynamic. Colonies and former colonies learning from each other, influencing each other. The whole decolonization movement has been strongly influenced by events happening in Indonesia. And this is not known in Europe, and I don't have the impression it's very well known in Asia either. And for me, it was important to show that global dynamic that was related to the Revolusi.
Okay, it's really nice to have someone and hopefully more people to believe that the birth of the Republic is so crucial, not only for Indonesia, but for the modern world as well, as you've emphasized in the subtitle of Revolusi. Hopefully this will bring us to do more, to contribute more to the Republic of Indonesia itself. So before inviting our other panelists, I want to ask another question. I want to start diving into one of the most striking metaphors you use in Revolusi, the Van der Wijk ship. This metaphor vividly captures the social hierarchy that existed during the colonial era in Indonesia, where people were rigidly divided into classes. The Van der Wijk tragedy not only symbolizes the sinking of a ship, but also reflects the collapse of a deeply unjust system that categorized human lives by their perceived worth. Could you share more about how you developed this metaphor and what it reveals about the social and political landscape of that time? How does this period compare to the changes that in the subsequent decades?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. It's at a given point, I was in Jakarta and I heard about the Van der Wijk ship and the disaster, the maritime disaster. And I said, like, this was 1936, beautiful white colonial ship sailing from Bali over Surabaya to Jakarta. Beautiful, slender, elegant ship, and all of a sudden it collapsed in a couple of minutes. And for me, when I heard about it, I said, like, this could be the opening scene of the book. It's almost a metaphor of the sudden reversal of the colonial situation. In 1936, the Governor General of the then Dutch Indies, he had said, "Listen, friends, we've been here for 300 years. We're going to stay on for another 300 years. After that, we can talk about independence." That was the Dutch mindset in 1936. And in that very year, the ship collapses, and it's like a metaphor for, wow, things can change very rapidly. But when I started doing more detailed research on the Van der Wijk ship, I found information about the victims, and at first I just wasn't taking note about it. I wanted to know the details of how did the ship look like, when did it collapse, why did it collapse, and I realized at a given point, but there's something interesting about this ship Most of the ships in the Dutch East Indies were run by the KPM, which was the Koninklijke Pakketmaatschappij, which was the company responsible for maritime, for shipping. And all these ships had at least 3 decks and very often 4 decks. And the decks were on top of each other. Deck number 1 was on top, was the most comfortable one. Deck number 3 and 4 were at the bottom of the ship. And I started gathering information on who was on deck number 1, who was on deck number 2, who was on deck number 3, 4. And the newspapers of the time allowed me to find details. You find names about a British banker on deck number 1, an American tourist and his wife who were on deck number 1, who had been visiting Bali in the 1930s, like Charlie Chaplin did at a given time as well. Some Dutch colonial administrators. So I started finding information. Deck number 2, people from mixed descent, the so-called Indos, the Indo-Europeans, who were, for instance, running a clothes shop in Surabaya. So I found information about individuals, their jobs, and where they were sleeping and sailing on the deck. And then I realized that this is more than ship architecture. This is sociology, abstract sociology made concrete in 3 floating dimensions. Aboard the ship, you saw an exact copy of the legal system that was in use during Dutch colonial times, which made a very strong distinction between the Dutch upper layer of society and what they used to call inlanders, the Indonesian indigenous populations. And at a given point, an intermediate layer was invented to accommodate for people who were considered to be in between, like Chinese traders, Indo-Europeans with less money. You had big Indo-Europeans on deck number 1. You had smaller Indo-Europeans. That's the words they used. They even had different legal systems for all of these decks. And at a given point, I started looking for detailed information. What sort of clothes did people wear on deck number 1, deck number 2, deck number 3? What sort of food? I mean, on deck number 1, you had a hut with a fan, with a toilet. You had an incredible dinner with 6, 7 plates. At deck number 3, people were eating some nasi and some dried fish at best. What sort of faiths would you find? Christians on top, Muslims in the middle, and Muslims and Chinese as well, Confucian people, and Muslims at the bottom. So there was a whole hierarchy replicating the colonial hierarchy, and the biggest one was how many people were there at these 3 levels? Millions and millions of people at the bottom, only a few 100,000 at the top layer of the ship. And if you look how much money they made, it was the reverse. The annual salaries of people on deck number 1 were 100 times larger than the salaries people were having on deck number 3. So for me, it allowed to find a visual metaphor of colonial stratification. And I think it's important, it was not an apartheid system. Apartheid means you have decks and nobody can change decks whatsoever. The funny thing was, a limited amount of mobility was possible on the colonial ship, so to speak. And the easiest mobility was going down. If you were on deck number 1 and you went bankrupt because you had an alcohol problem, you ended up in deck number 2. For instance, if you were from mixed descent, your father was Dutch, your mother was, for instance, Javanese, you had a factory, but you went bankrupt, you had a drinking problem, you went down. The fastest way to move up was from deck number 3 to deck number 1 was being young, being female, being very pretty, and being picked up by a Dutch colonizer. And the other form of mobility was very limited. You had like these very small stairs between the decks. And the only way to climb the stair was education. Most of the education was organized so that everybody stayed on the deck on which he was born and was going to die on the same deck. But a limited number of people could move from deck 3 to 2 or from deck 2 to 1. And you would think these are the happy ones. They are the ones making social progress. And if you study colonial societies, not just in Indonesia, but also in India, also in Congo, you will see that the beginning of a decolonization thinking starts with the people who are trying to go to deck number 1, because they do enormous efforts studying medicine, studying architecture, studying engineering, and they see whatever we do, there is always the glass ceiling. Whatever efforts we do to be considered as full, entirely recognized citizens, there is still this color bar through which we cannot go. Somebody like Sukarno, I mean, very critically, he was an engineer trained at Bandung, looking up in the beginning to the colonial presence, and then realizing this could not be done. Somebody like Gandhi, I mean, we all know Gandhi dressed in his loincloth. He used to wear 3-piece suits and playing the violin, trying to pass for a full English boy, even in London, when he realized, I'm never going to be accepted. And this is the moment those who are trying to go from deck number 2 to deck number 1, hurting themselves time and again against the glass ceiling of the colonial upper layer, there's one moment when they turn their back and try to talk to deck number 2 and deck number 3 and try to build the movement of decolonization. This is what you see time and again. Same with Lumumba in Congo, for instance.
Okay, thank you, David. We actually have a book, and also it has been adapted to a film called Tenggelamnya Kapal Van der Wijk, but we never really talk about it, let alone talking about the layers behind of the issue. So thank you so much for that, David. It's always fascinating to hear directly from the author and get a sense of the motivations and thoughts behind the work. That really sets the stage for a deeper understanding of Revolusi. Now I won't be diving into this conversation alone. I've got some incredible panelists with me who I introduced earlier. They are ready to share their insights and ask you some questions as well. So let's bring our first panelist into the conversation, Mbak Ayu Utami.
Hello, David. Hello, Olive.
Hi, Mbak Ayu.
Nice to see you again, David, after so long.
Yes, it's been a while. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
Mbak Ayu, after hearing David's explanation, I was curious about your thoughts on how he portrayed this era. Were there specific narratives or themes that resonate with you, or perhaps even challenge your own understanding of our history? But instead of me asking, I will leave that to you. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Olive. First of all, David, I would like to thank for this book. It's really a great book. It's great in the issues and in the writing style. But my question is, in the beginning, when seeing the title of the book, within this, say, 5 years, there are several important books about Indonesia's independent revolution published, be it in original language or in translation, in Indonesian translation. And Revolusi from you is one of them. The other is later than your books, Merdeka by Puse and Nordholt, and other Dunia Revolusi also by a group of writers from Indonesia and Holland. And in 2022, there was an exhibition titled Revolusi in Rijksmuseum, and another exhibition about Indonesia, Grote Indonesia in Nieuwe Kerk in Amsterdam. So this, suddenly I realized, or probably it's not sudden, but I just realized that there is some interest about the history of the formation of Indonesia take place around the same time. My question is whether it is just a coincidence or there is something happened that trigger your interest and their interest about this special time of Indonesia. I also curious about, because this happened in like 2013, 2015 until 2020. Do you think it has relation to what happens in Indonesia at that time, which is the euphoria of Jokowi as governor of DKI and later as Indonesian president? Because at that time, Indonesia was on the spotlight in international media. So yeah, the question is whether these interests that happened together is just a coincidence or something in Indonesia triggered your interest. Please,
That's a
David.
great but a difficult question. You're asking me to talk about the history of historical interest in Indonesia.
At least in your books, and
yeah.
the recent
Yeah.
recent books published.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you suggest related to the rise to power by President Jokowi. And it would be interesting to see to what extent that has inspired a new generation of Indonesian historians and Indonesian publications. It's true, there has been a wave. I think in Europe, in the Netherlands, it's rather unrelated to the political developments in Indonesia. I think there are two.
So your interest doesn't have any relation with this euphoria at that time.
No, I don't think so.
2010, 2012, 2015. No.
I don't think there's been much in the Netherlands. There has not been a lot of euphoria when it comes to Indonesia, because when you talk about Indonesia, it's more often the past than the present. And so I think that two factors have been important. The rise of colonial studies in Anglo-American universities that has been, closely followed up in the Netherlands, where everybody speaks English and where the intellectual interest is very much turned towards the English-speaking world. And I think a second event is important and has not been really quite talked about enough. It is that the public debate in the Netherlands on Indonesia has been for a very long time determined by two groups of people. And it's the people who came back from Indonesia at the end of the 1940s and early 1950s. It's the veterans from the war, 120,000 people who came back, who had been there for a couple of years. And secondly, the repatriation of almost 300,000 people of deck number one, basically, Dutch colonizers and Dutch colonizers of mixed descent, the Indo-Europeans coming back. It's almost 500,000 people who around 1950, 1955, 56 go back to the Netherlands, and they are the one who are going to determine the public debate for a long time to come. Because only very, very few Indonesians have made it to the Netherlands themselves. After 1965, a few have come. I've interviewed a few of them. But compared to Belgium, I'm Belgium, I live in Brussels. We have a very large Congolese community. And they have been really important in asking attention for the colonial past. With the absence of a large Indonesian community in the Netherlands, the debate on the colonial past has been mostly determined by people on deck number one and deck number two, basically. So it's the top layer of colonial society who came back to the Netherlands. And for instance, when in the 1980s already, Lou de Jong, who was a famous Dutch historian working on World War II, in the early 1980s, he was preparing a volume on Indonesia as a sequel to his book on World War II and its consequences. And before the book got published, sample chapters were circulated amongst veterans, and the veterans were extremely angry at what was being said. And Lou de Jong had to rewrite that part of his book to take into account the political, emotional sensitivities of that generation and that population. So you see to what extent it's only now, with this population aging and dying, that a different discourse is being possible now.
Yeah, it's very also interesting that this new perspective happens only today, and still there are controversies. And your book is it's not a, I mean, I will say that it's not a historical book only. It goes beyond that, and it is written in a literary journalism way that makes it enjoyable to read. But your book is special among the other books also because it has a distinctive insight. And this insight is, you've mentioned it, that you stated very clearly in the last chapter that there is a big achievement of Sukarno after Indonesia's independence, which was the Bandung Conference in 1955, the Konferensi Asia Afrika. I don't know whether today's Indonesian students are still acquainted with this historical event.
Mm.
I still have to learn it at school, and I still have to memorize names like Nkrumah, Lumumba, Nasser. Yeah, I still I'm the generation from the past. I don't know what the new generation now.
Mm.
And in fact, there is a name in the Bendungan Hilir named after Patrice Lumumba. But the Bandung Conference in the book, it seems you like to call it Bandung Conference than Asia Africa Conference.
Mm.
And you described it as a kind of epicentrum of a tsunami. You don't use the word epicentrum. Yeah, I think you don't use it. But for me, it's like you described a kind of epicentrum of a big wave that changed the world.
Mm.
And you say nothing stay the same after 1955 Bandung Conference.
Mm.
And for me, this is a very opening, because I never hear about that, and I never think about this way, that nothing stays the same after Bandung Conference. We know Bandung Conference, but we never thought that it has such a big impact in the world. And you show us many quotations and descriptions about that. It's very beautiful. I think your last chapter is really opening eye for me. You show quotes from Martin Luther King. Very beautiful. It's a real quote. What year was that? Yeah.
The quote from Martin Luther King was from, I think, later in 1955, a few months after the Bandung Conference. Malcolm X praised it. Nelson Mandela praised the Bandung Conference.
So the name, I mean, I want to say to the audience, yeah, the name Bandung was mentioned by Martin Luther King, by Malcolm X, by Mandela, by these black writers from the American Black writers. It's a very good quotation. I want to read it a bit from Malcolm X. More than 1,300,000,000 of the colored peoples of the world have broken from colonialism and imperialism. Yes, sir. They assembled in Bandung some months ago, and that was the word that echoed from Bandung. Racism and colonialism must go. And I think I would thank you, David, here, because I don't think Indonesian never get access on these materials. How big the impact of Bandung Conference, and you can. I think I haven't read the who's the name, the Black American writers, Richard Wright. Richard Wright. Richard Wright, Who Knows, Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Camus. That was great. I mean, I think that was it is a chance for us to dig more materials. You open up this point of view for others to oppose you, probably to contest you, or to explore more. But yeah, my question is, how did you get the insight about how important is the Bandung spirit? I mean, I've never heard about it before.
Right. I actually learned about Bandung when I was 12 years old when I was 17 years old in my last year of high school. Our history teacher told us about the Bandung Conference and the beginning of the non-aligned movement and the Third World. And but it's not just in Indonesia, Ayu, that people don't remember the importance of the Bandung Conference. It's been forgotten. And the last couple of years, you see a growing appreciation of the historical moment it was. And the reason we have forgotten it is because, well, the forces against it were very powerful. The Bandung movement, the Bandung Conference, was the first conference in the world without the West, without white people. more than half of the population of the world, of the global population, were represented at Bandung. And all agreed that the times of colonialism were over. So they agreed that the North-South dynamic had to change. They disagreed on the East-West dynamic. Some were communist, others were capitalist. So there was some disagreement there. And the idea was we are going to continue this. And a second Bandung conference was planned, but it never took place. It was planned in Algeria. Some people wanted to organize it in the Bronx. Civil rights activists in the US wanted to have a second Bandung in the Bronx. This never materialized, but something changed. What changed after Bandung is that people went home and started to realize that independence was not just a national question. Somebody like Nasser, who was just president of Egypt, he didn't want to go to Bandung in the first place. Prime Minister Nehru had to call him like, Gamal, you have to come, it's going to be interesting. And on his way back, 1 week later, he said, this is one of the most important events in the 20th century, together with the invention of nuclear energy. Atomic energy and Bandung were seen at the same par. And Nasser went home and he started spreading the news of Bandung by his radio stations, first in Arabic, influencing the Middle East, Northern Africa. And then he used his radio station to make programs in Swahili so that people on Zanzibar and Kenya and Tanzania could learn about it. So there was a really growing enthusiasm for this movement. The Arab world was changed. Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa was changed. The civil rights movement in the US took inspiration from it. The Black Panthers, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott just a few months after Bandung, all this was seen as a movement. And the reason we have forgotten about this is that between 1955 and 1965, especially the United States, have been clamping down on the Bandung movement because they feared it was going to become too communist. And if you look at the number of heads of state that have been replaced thanks to the CIA in these years, it's very high. I've written 2 books on colonial history, one on Congo, one on Indonesia. In the same year, in the same month, the head of state in Congo and Indonesia is replaced by the CIA after a military coup. In Indonesia, Sukarno was replaced by Suharto. In Congo, Kasavubu was replaced by Mobutu. And a military officer took power with the support of the CIA because not being democratic was bad, but being communist was much worse. So the Americans repressed that movement. And so the Bandung movement was like this beginning of a sort of global awareness in terms of global justice, non-discrimination, that has been curtailed mostly by the dynamics of the Americans. One thing, though, they could not change, and it is that the Bandung movement led to one very important change. It's the composition of the United Nations. The United Nations, when they started after World War II, were called a global organization, but it was mostly Western. The participants at the Bandung conference in April 55 all became members of the United Nations in September 55. And in the next years, you see how more diverse and how more southern the United Nations are going to become. And in the early 60s, you will even have the first Secretary General of the United Nations, who is not a Western, is U Thant from Burma, from Myanmar. So you see, this is a transformation that has been absolutely crucial, and it happened thanks to the Bandung movement.
Yeah, and you say it beautifully, and I wonder whether somebody else had say something about that before you. About the importance of Bandung. I mean, I know I just interviewed 2 years ago. I met the Al-Akhdar Brahimi. He used to be the foreign minister of Algeria, and he was in Bandung as the observer from Algeria, which at that time was not didn't get the independence yet. So he was very inspired by Sukarno and by Bandung Conference, by the Dasar-Sila Bandung. So I realized that how important is that. But to connect the Bandung Conference with what happens, what this connection in your book, I admire that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think, I mean, there is some scholarship and some really interesting scholarship on the Bandung Conference, but they forget about Indonesia. And there's great scholarship on Indonesia, but often they forget about the global consequence of the Bandung Conference. So I think I brought these two strands together because I think if you look at Sukarno's opening speech, he literally says like, Asia, Africa is Indonesia, but just at a bigger scale. We're very diverse, but Indonesia is very diverse as well. We're very different. We are very different. We have different religions. We have different religion in Indonesia. So there was an explicit connection was made between the Indonesian Perang Kemerdekaan and the Bandung Conference and what was happening on a global scale. So that connection is a pretty obvious one. In the beginning, somebody here in the chat mentioned Sir John Kotalawala in the beginning, who was from Ceylon, Sri Lanka. In the beginning, the idea was only to hold a conference with 5 countries who had been recently independent. And it was 4 former British colonies and Indonesia. And that idea was being prepared, and it was put to the table of Sukarno, and Sukarno said, no, let's be more visionary. Let's extend the invitation. Let us invite other countries as well, countries who are independent or countries who are aspiring to become independent. And so he was the one who turned it into this global event. And as a consequence of that, Sukarno became a global leader. He was invited in the US Senate. He got standing ovation. And then afterwards, he was invited in Russia and he was invited to the Vatican. I mean, he was invited everywhere. He was literally, he was not in the camp of capitalist America, nor in the camp of communist Russia. He even played sometimes a role of a go-between. He played an extraordinary role there on the global scene as one of the heralds of the decolonization movement.
Yeah, that's true. And I think also in your book, at the end of the book is a very beautiful summary in which you use Bandung and Jakarta as a kind of like, not epitome, but like a symbols.
Yeah.
Bandung is the symbol of anti-colonialism with the Bandung Conference, but you also use the story and mentioned that Jakarta, referring to what happened in 1965, becomes a kind of symbol of repression by the United States within the Cold War.
Yeah.
Because the method of Jakarta is repeated in many countries in the Latin America. And I think the way you connect this, you use Indonesia as symbols, which has its reason, it's very powerful. And yeah, I would like to thank you for that. I have a lot of other questions, but I don't know whether I am still allowed to ask questions because I think my time is up. Yeah. Gimana?
We have to move on to the second panelist, but maybe we can
So
continue.
I hope, David, you will come to Jakarta to discuss about your book.
I will. The moment it's available in Indonesian, I step on a plane and I come to talk about it.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Ayu, for sharing your thoughts and for the engaging questions. I'm also keeping an eye on the chat, and it looks like some of our audience members are having a lively discussion in the chat box right now. Mbak Ayu, you're welcome to stay with us, or if you need to step out, feel free to do so. We really appreciate your time and insights today. And before I invite our next panelist, I would like to remind everyone to take a look at the chat box. A form has been made available by the Periplus committee for you to submit your questions for David. However, if you'd like to ask a question directly, you'll have the chance to do so at the end. So start thinking about what you would like to ask David. Now, moving on to our next panelist, I would like to call Mbak Irine. Are you with us? Okay, Mbak Irine, hello.
Hello, how are you? Hi, David. Hi, Olivia.
Hi,
Hi,
Mbak Irine.
Mbak Ayu.
Mbak Irine, given your extensive research on Indonesia's independence, I'm sure you have some thoughts on how Revolusi portrays this critical period. Instead of posing my own questions, I would like to pass the floor to you to engage directly with David. Please, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Olivia. Hello, David. I'm just
Hello,
like,
Irine.
this is the book. So I put several post-it notes. So you see, and because I only had read probably half of chapter 3, but I skimmed several chapters. And I will just straightly mention that this is a very impressive work. And
Thank you.
myself, I enjoy it, not only because of the thickness of the history that you use, but also, and this is my point of view as a researcher, I'm a social researcher. My major is international relations. So the points that Ayu made earlier on how you portray Sukarno and Bandung and non-aligned movement at the center of the discussion deliver strong message on how to understand Indonesia at the times of Revolusi. The message from the Periplus when I was asked to do this panel is to accentuate the role of youth, the youthness, the militancy. Because as an Indonesian, and I think we came from probably a similar generation, my childhood was we were quite familiar as an Indonesian. We were quite familiar. What does 17 August means tomorrow, right? So it's Declaration of Independence. Everybody wearing red and white costume. We raise flag in front of house. And then we also commemorate the valor, the patriotism of our predecessors, especially the founding fathers, Sukarno, Hatta, and the rest. And the pemuda who dragged him to finally able to declare proclamation. So that is one aspect of the independent proclamation that I think you share with us here in the audience. But what impressed me most is how you could dig the daily lives of people during the revolution. You mentioned in this book, the eldest person you interviewed was what, 104 years? So he experienced perhaps the peak of independence period, early days of Orde Baru, the transition democracy under Sukarno, and the vibrant political, at least in Jakarta, for the common people. So with me, besides your book, I also, I skimmed several other books. For instance, Ongkok Ham's The Fall of Dutch Indies. I think you are familiar also with this book, right? Because he's also in your narrative about Indonesia or pre-Indonesia during VOC, clearly accentuate the relationship of the global trade between the whites, the VOC, but also their interaction with the British troops, for instance, in East Indonesia. And also, you also clearly describe the displaced expression on how the VOC is seen by the locals and how the VOC or the incoming traders come and see how the people, the locals, right? So I think my first question would be, although you had described it very succinctly, I think amongst the audience, not all of them is quite detailed in how history is portrayed in your book. So my first question would be, how do you use historical context to shape Indonesian independence struggle in Revolusi? So that's my first question.
Thank you, and thank you for your feedback. I really appreciate and enjoy it.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I tried to tell the story of the independence of this big country mostly by making history as tangible as possible. I am an archaeologist by training, which means that for me, history is more than just words. It's objects, it's landscapes, it's stories. It's not just what ends up in archives. And so when I talk about the older periods for which we have no longer living witnesses, I try to make it as tangible as possible by referring not just to political constellations, but to what happens to spices. I mean, this is so obvious in the case of the Dutch East Indies, and and how the VOC in the 17th century was struggling hard to have spices to make sure that they were going to bring them to Europe and make huge profits. And then when the moment they have this monopoly at the end of the 17th century, around 1700, they realize that something has changed in Europe. French cuisine has emerged. And the French think like, oh, we don't like spices anymore. Let's have pure taste. Let's drink champagne, which was invented in, and eat truffle and lobster. And so without all these spices, let's go for pure tastes. And then the Dutch start to panic and they realize we need another product. Let's see coffee and tea. These are new drinks. The French cooks and the French chefs are promoting coffee, tea, and hot chocolate. These were aristocratic drinks. Let's go on land in the region, in the archipelago. Spices were just bought aboard a ship and they wanted to sail back home as quickly as possible. But for coffee and tea, you need land, you need plantations. You know, I try to tell this story by making it as vivid as possible. And as soon as possible, I use ego documents, personal narratives. They enliven the situation, they enliven the history, and they really make you understand what people did at a given point. And a next step would be, you start from objects, you go from first person narratives, and then you go to oral history. It's for me, the biggest work in writing this book was not the writing, it was the listening, sitting down with people and learning what they had to say and just finding them. And I had to find people between the age of 90 and 104, very old people, trying to find the last living witnesses of the colonial time, of the Japanese occupation, of the War of Independence, of the independence. And I really had to hurry when I was doing field work in Indonesia, but also in Japan to find veterans in Japan, to Nepal to find Gurkha veterans. At a given point, Irene, I told myself, I'm so stressed in finding these witnesses in time, I will never get as old as my witnesses. This is not good for my heart. Traveling and working so hard. But it was worth it because in the end, I succeeded in interviewing almost 200 people who were time witnesses. And sometimes, I mean, in the beginning, I followed the language course in Yogyakarta, and my language teacher took me. I just asked, like, do you know somebody who is old? Orang tua, always the good. And then they took me to their grandfather or to an uncle on the countryside near Klaten. And before you realize you do your first interview, and I remember actually it was very frustrating and very funny, Irene. My very first interview, I've been studying Indonesian for 1 or 2 weeks. I entered the room in a farm on the countryside. There's children, there's family members. There's this old man sitting on the bed. And I start with my very timid Indonesian. And he said, the first thing, he said, oh, Indonesian. I don't speak it. It's a modern language. I only speak middle and lower Javanese. So it was not very encouraging for somebody learning Indonesian. But so in the beginning, you just go for anybody who's old. And then I became more specific. I started visiting people in homes for the elderly in Jakarta, on the outskirts of Jakarta, interviewing people. And then in a later stage, I really wanted to find somebody. I wanted to find a Gurkha veteran who was on Java in 1945-46. And I went to Nepal to find them. Actually, I found 10 of them. There were only 30 of them were still alive. I think they're all dead now. And I went to Manado to find people who had seen the arrival of the very, very first Japanese boats in March 42. So all this was part of the research. And these witness accounts, for me, are not just important because they make the text more readable and more lively. It really helps you to understand the complexity of history. if you say like the Indonesians felt such and such about the Dutch, well, there's a big difference. If you talk to a communist, if you talk to a nationalist, if you talk to somebody who is from the Sarakat Islam. And so hearing these different voices is like hearing different perspectives. History is like a diamond, a rough diamond, and you have to change it every time to catch a different light. And that is what I've been trying to do by interviewing all those people.
Wow, that is really rich. And to be honest, I admire that, and also a bit reflected back to what I did with my several of colleague in for foundation as well, oral history of 1965. We probably a bit we shared your experience as well. We needed to find eyewitness of the event, ask them what they did and they thought about that time. So I am so sorry if you could have met my grandfather, because he used to be a wadana at Bandung during Westerling. So, and he was an artist. So he witnessed, firsthand how was the impact of the Westerling action in Bandung. But that is really great. And I think your information just now about how you did and how you use history to shape and to frame the whole story of the independent struggle would deliver a very important message for Indonesian students if they are present here. Because sometimes in the Indonesian education system, this is kind of autocratic, history is not presented interestingly. Only probably the last 5 years. There, as you mentioned in a chapter, in a page in your book Revolusi, that right now there is these changes in the way history is taught in Indonesia, right? And that also related to the second point that I wanted to ask. To what extent Revolusi has succeeded in showing the picture of Indonesian Revolution as a very decisive moment in the 20th century. Do you think after your book is done and being read and reviewed, I saw several of reviews of your book, you think after you reflected on those reviews perhaps, or even after you did finish the publication, you think there has been, there is some narratives that have not been presented yet?
Right. Thank you.
Or underrepresented, sorry.
Ayu Utami just said, like, for me, it was new to see the importance of the Bandung conference, and it sheds new light. Eye-opening is the word she used. I'm happy to hear this, because this is one of the ambitions of the book. I think I've been, even after the book is ready, I still think about it. There's something strange with revolutions.
Yeah.
If they happen in the Northern Hemisphere, they're seen as world history, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. If they happen in the Southern Hemisphere, they're seen as local events. Now this is changing. And it's changing not yet with the Indonesian Revolusi, but it's the first revolution in the South that is being considered as an incredibly important historical global event is the Revolusi in Haiti in 1804. Just a few years after the French Revolution of 1789, Haiti in the Caribbean, which was a French territory, it's the moment where slaves stand up and throw away the colonial power in order to liberate themselves. This was long seen as a local revolt at best. Now it's seen as the beginning of the very first country in the South that liberated itself from centuries of Western presence. And I think the Indonesian Revolusi will grow in importance the more we study it, and the more we realize that this has been an event of global importance. And so, yes, I would hope to see this sort of awareness of the importance. It was important for Indonesia, of course. It's the beginning of the country. Tomorrow we all celebrate this, but it is also the beginning of a world that tried to redress the balance.
Thank you, David. So because when we're talking about underrepresented ideas in the global history of Indonesia, as an international relations student, this is precisely what the critic of international relations discuss about, because it has a tendency to center to the bipolarity, regardless other South Hemisphere did anything in order to take themselves out of slavery, or like Indonesia at the start of the revolution, it doesn't mean much. So when for instance, I learned from my father that Nkrumah was actually Sukarno's one of the best friends, and also several other leaders in the global south. And they actually quite envy on how Indonesia could declare the independent proclamation. And up to the level, for instance, despite everything that, a bit chaotic in Indonesian politics, the way we manage ourselves after 1998, it was rumored that we will enter sort of Yugoslavia's Balkanization of Indonesia, but it did not happen. So that leads me to, for instance, third questions. But this is somewhat it touched upon one of the important elements that also relate to your discussion on the response of the community in the Netherlands, seeing how vibrant Revolusi is, the independent movement, but the response is somewhat different. So perhaps Belgium, so you are a Belgian, a very, very open-minded, self-critic Belgium toward the history, because you wrote Congo. So Belgium also has a colonial history in Africa, Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, and Lado Enclave in Sudan. You also wrote Congo. So do you think during the process of the writing, your reflection toward the Belgium's past also affect the way you empathize and also project about the society under the Dutch in this context, or under the VOC, and the struggle by the youth, the militant youth?
Well, obviously, we are always influenced today by what we have done yesterday. And so having written a book on Congo clearly helped me to write a book on Indonesia. And it's not so strange, because Belgian colonialism, which started only in the 19th century, took a lot of inspiration from Dutch colonialism. The Belgian king, Leopold II, looked very clearly to what the Dutch kings, William I and II, had been doing in Indonesia. Like, how do you do this? Organizing a colony, running a colony. The Dutch had been there for a long time. And in the early 19th century, it was the Dutch kings who played such an important role. And so many elements from Dutch colonialism were transplanted to the Congolese context. For instance, colonizing is expensive. Yes, it brings in a lot of money, but in the beginning you have to invest a lot of money. So one way to make it cheaper is use local authorities. So you have a top layer, and then you try to work with local aristocracies. This happened on Java very clearly. The Javanese aristocracy became much involved. Multatuli was criticizing the way the Javanese aristocracy had become so cruel to its own people because they worked together with the Dutch. The same system was applied, literally copied. The copy of the notion of indirect rule was copied to the Congo, and later also in Rwanda. So there is a continuity. But to come back to your first remark, Irine, I'm really glad that you mentioned the friendship between Nkrumah and Sukarno.
Yes.
And I'm really glad that both you and Ayu refer to the global consequences. I think when tomorrow people in Indonesia celebrate, they should celebrate two things. The fact that the Revolusi made the fourth biggest country in the world independent, Indonesia. And secondly, and perhaps for the first time so explicitly, the fact that it is that same country that inspired and contributed to a dynamic that was so important for the global South and parts of the global North as well.
Thank you. That is really great. I don't know if my time is still up. I saw several questions in the chat room.
Unfortunately, yeah, your time is up.
Time is up. I prepared 15 questions for you actually, but I could email.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mbak Irine, for those insights. It's been fascinating to hear this discussion about the success of the Indonesian Revolution, reflecting on how far Indonesia has come since gaining independence. It's incredible to think about the resilience and strength that have been built over the years. The term revolution has evolved in meaning, yeah, but its importance remains as significant as ever. David has also mentioned how the Indonesian Revolution's significance continues to grow, not just within the country, but also in terms of global resilience and importance. I think it's a powerful reminder for us all of how history isn't just something in the past, but it's also something that continues to shape our present and future. This discussion has been so engaging that it's almost a shame we have to start wrapping things up before the Q&A session. But Irine, if you need to head out, no worries at all. Thank you again for being here with us today. We
I
really
will still be here lingering, listening to the question.
Okay. Before we jump into the Q&A session and give David a moment to prepare for even more questions, let's take a moment to capture this event with a group photo. I would like to invite everyone to turn on your cameras so we can get a snapshot of all the faces who joined us today. It's a great way to commemorate this insightful discussion. So once everyone's ready, we'll take a few shots. So feel free to smile, to wave, or just be yourself.
Okay.
Will assist in capturing the photo.
Okay, thank you. I will make 2 pictures. So the first picture in 1, 2, and 3. Okay, we go to the second. Okay. The second. 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Olive.
Thank you, Kak. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for the photo. It's wonderful to see all of you here with us. Now, let's move on to the Q&A session. Are you ready, David? I see that many of the audience have already submitted the questions in the text box. So I will be reading out some of the chosen questions briefly, and then I will invite David to share his thoughts and answers with us. And also for those of you who would like to ask a question directly, please let us know in the chat box, and I will call your name for the next question. So let's get started with the first question. This one is a bit long. It's from Rania Belva in Yogyakarta. You have mentioned several times during the session that there is a growing interest in re-examining colonialism among first world countries. What do you think the outcome of this re-examination will be? Do you believe it will merely uncover multiple perspectives on colonialism, or do you think this rising interest will lead to concrete anti-colonialist actions, such as the return of valuable artifacts taken by colonial powers to their countries of origin, or even attempts at reparations?
Great question to start with. Thank you so much. I think we are seeing more historical awareness about histories that have been hidden so far. This is positive. I also see that this is nourishing debates about changing public references in terms of street names, statues, school books. In Holland, you have statues of Koen, who committed a genocide on the Banda Islands in 1621. You still have a tunnel in Amsterdam. The longest tunnel of Amsterdam is still called the Koen Tunnel. It's very dark, but it's no reason why it should be called after Koen. There's also the entire discussion of restitution of objects that have been taken unwillfully and illegally from those who owned them at first. That discussion is very strong in Belgium as well when it comes to bringing back objects. All this is happening, but I hope something extra will happen as well. If we only deal with colonialism as a historical event, we run the risk of forgetting a colonialism that is still happening today. And I think the biggest colonialism of today is global warming. Global warming has been principally caused by the richer countries of the Northern Hemisphere. It's about 20 countries who are responsible for it. And it's mostly felt by people in the global south, especially in the tropics and the subtropics. So if we only change street names and statues and school books, and if we only return a couple of historical objects to museums, And we continue here in the north, where I'm working now, we continue to warm the planet at the expense of lives and livelihoods and families in the global south. I think we're missing out something. So my hope would be that greater historical awareness about the colonial past also leads to greater awareness of forms of global injustices that are still going on and being perpetrated at a massive scale today.
Thank you for the answer, David. Does anyone want to ask another question directly? You can raise your hand. Okay, let's move to the next question first. Thank you so much for the explanation before. The second question is from Ervan Supradono from Surabaya. Hi, David. What inspired you to write this book? I heard that it took you around 6 years to complete it. What kept you motivated to continue despite all the challenges and obstacles you faced during the process?
That's a great question. Thank you, Irine. It's what kept me motivated is that in order to find witnesses, I told many people I was looking for witnesses. I even said it on the national radio in the Netherlands. I said it on Facebook. I even used Tinder, where I was looking for their grandmothers and grandfathers. I promised so many people I was going to write this book that I felt I had to write it as well. But it was, to be honest, it was a difficult book to write. It was more difficult than Congo because the history is so much more complicated. And what kept me going was the intrinsic motivation. It's a beautiful country. It's a massive country. It's a history which is not sufficiently known outside of Indonesia itself. People should learn about it. I'm fascinated by this. I want to share what I found. I've been able to talk to so many wonderful witnesses, elderly Indonesian ladies in homes for the elderly, singing songs of the Revolusi that were never in not a single archive. I felt I had to share all this. And what kept me going was like, people should know about this. One of the reasons that Indonesia is so little known is also because it's not an English or a French-speaking colony. Lots of the archives are inaccessible for speakers. And so that's, now that the book is available in English, this is also something I get as a feedback. This is a history which was not on our radar. That kept me going. And obviously the chance to be in a Periplus Zoom webinar, that was what I did it for.
Thank you, David. Hope it answers the question to Kak Ervan Supradono. I saw Pak Cornelis Luhulima raise the hand. Do you want to ask the question directly, Pak Cornelis? Mungkin boleh di-unmute dulu, Bapak, untuk mic-nya.
Mute, yeah? Okay. Actually, my question is on the book itself. I read the English version, beautifully written, and then I asked for the original Dutch version. It's also nicely written, except the Netherlands never had a Shakespeare. It's actually on your chapter 1, where you wrote the VOC mentality, why Indonesia wrote world history. And then later, chapter 15. Okay. Chapter says, the VOC mentality, why Indonesia wrote world history. When the Dutch came for the spices in the Moluccas and started occupying the area, which was later finalized into the Dutch East Indies in 1914, right? Ambon was too far away, so Jan Pieterszoon Koen moved the VOC headquarters to Batavia. It's interesting to note why you wrote, why Indonesia wrote world history, implying that Indonesia's history writing as world history already started as early as 17th century, right? Okay, now I go to chapter 15. Chapter 15, Into the Light of Morning. The Indonesian Revolution and the World After 1950. Transfer of sovereignty. Sukarno already already outgrown actually the bilateral relations with the Netherlands, Indonesian Netherlands. And it was in 17th of August 1950 that Sukarno broke definitely with the Netherlands. And then he declared the termination of the United States of Indonesia. There is only one Republic of Indonesia, one territory, one constitution, and one government. But from chapter 1 to chapter 15, you describe in chapter 15 how Indonesia carried or propagated Indonesia's revolution to the world by Bandung Conference. My question is, you didn't finish actually whether the Revolusi has ended or was ended. Why? Jakarta, Republik Indonesia, didn't change the seat of the Indonesian government. It is still Batavia. It's still Jakarta. So the revolution is actually not yet over. The revolution will only be over if you move the capital city from Java to an island outside Java, also to get away from the Java centrism. Now, my question to you is, do you think that your book, Revolusi, is actually implying that the revolution has succeeded, is over? And if you look at Indonesia's situation in Indonesia now, the one who actually would like to move the capital city to Ibu Kota Nusantara is someone who doesn't belong to the Indonesian political elite. He came from the riverbanks of the river in Solo. And he moved capital city to be able to get away from the Java-centric attitude of leadership. I think that part should, if I may advise it to you, should actually finalize your book on Revolusi Indonesia, the movement of the capital city.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion, especially because tomorrow the capital city will be opened, the Ibu Kota Nusantara. To come back to your first remark, the title of chapter number 1 is different between the English translation and the Dutch original, because in the Dutch original there's a reference to a parliamentary debate in the Netherlands, and that's why the title of the chapter was changed in order to be understandable for an international audience. I think if you compare the two versions, you will see. Your question is a really interesting one, Pak, and I appreciate it very much. Has colonialism ended? Has the Revolusi been completed? As long as Indonesia has remained Java-centric. There's a long discussion, like the Dutch have gone, but Java has continued to colonize the rest of the archipelago. This is an argument you often hear when in discussions about Papua, for instance, or the Southern Moluccas. This was also a discussion. I think it's a really important discussion. It's beyond the scope of my book, because my book was about the end of Dutch colonial rule and the end of Western colonial rule. And you're quite right. It is not because one form of political power is over that all problems are solved. It might very well be the case that Indonesian history entered a new phase that was strongly Java-centric. But my question is, and I think it's the question for everybody in Indonesia today, will it change? Does changing the capital from Java to Kalimantan, will that change a sort of Java-centric perspective? Or will Borneo become Java-centric as well? Is Java just colonizing, so to speak, a part of Kalimantan? This remains to be seen. My idea was that the prime motivation for changing the capital was not necessarily to move beyond a Java-centric perspective. It had to do with practical reasons, traffic reasons, logistic reasons, and the chance to start anew near Balikpapan.
Well, that was the argument of the new of President Joko Widodo, to move the capital to get away from Java-centrism and to become more Indonesia-centric.
Yep.
That was his argument.
Yep. We'll see if that works out in practice, but it's interesting to hear it's part of the argument. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pak Cornelis, for the great question, and also David for answering. We've seen a lot of audience raise their hand already, but now that we're nearing the end of our discussion time, unfortunately, this next question will be the last one I can read out today. Bu Betty Indira, I think you raised your hand first, so you can ask the question directly to David.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, actually, I really wait for this moment, and I'm so happy that I can ask to you directly. You don't know how much this book means to me, although I really, until now, I can only read it like for until 193 pages. Okay, but well, maybe my questions are very trivial, so you can choose to answer it or not. Okay, so actually I have 3 questions, but I don't know, you can just answer one of those 3 questions. Well, my first question, and I mean, like, when I read it, I really don't get it. I mean, like, how and why did the Nazi capture Indonesians? I mean, like, because you said in your books that some Indonesians, well, as far as I can get it, it's like some Indonesians were captured by the Nazi and they died in the camps. I mean, like, why? I mean, why did they capture Indonesians? I mean, because we're not Jewish.
Yeah.
That's the first question. And okay, and the second one, okay, I will only ask 2 questions. And the second one, what do you think would happen if Tan Malaka wasn't assassinated? What do you think? I mean, like, who do you and what do you think will be like the future? Maybe it influenced the future of Indonesia. Maybe what will be, I mean, the difference if he's still alive? And it is maybe a bit political. And who do you think that make the order to kill him? I mean, just your analysis. Okay, so thank you so much, David.
Yeah, thank you, Betty. These are great questions. Some Indonesians were in Europe during World War II, and quite a number of them in the Netherlands became politically active. They didn't like colonialism, but they liked fascism even less. And so they said, like, we will stop fighting for Indonesian independence. First, we have to fight the German Nazis, the German fascism. And so I was lucky. The oldest person I interviewed, Raden Mas Jayeng Pratomo, he was one of those people who was in the Netherlands in the 1930s. He became an opponent, a resistance fighter, fighting against the fascist presence by printing, by helping Jews, by organizing resistance. And together with his Dutch girlfriend, they were arrested and they were sent to the concentration camps, and they both survived. And I found their daughter gave me the letters that they were sending to each other in the concentration camps. Absolutely incredible story. So the Nazis put many people in the concentration camps. but not just Jews. Political activists entered into the camps as well, because they were seen as enemies of the Nazi regime. That's the reason. And then, very, very good question. What would have happened if Tan Malaka was still alive? It's like asking what would have happened if JF Kennedy was not shot. You know, it's very hard. Reconstructing the past is hard, but reconstructing the future is even harder. But I think there would have been a fair chance that he would have become a president, or would have been in a high political position. The tension with Sukarno would have broken out. We just don't know. Hari Poeze has written 3 fantastic books on Tan Malaka and what happened to him. And it's very, very hard to tell what would have happened, but it's for sure that the political history of Indonesia would have been very different. He was such a bright, such a smart, such an influential. What would have happened if Sultan Shahrir would not have died so young in Switzerland in the 1960s? What would have happened if he and Sukarno would not have broken up? Sultan Shahrir is one of the persons, they're not very well known in Europe, but I thought it was important to share about this important intellectual and activist. Yeah. I have a few more minutes. I mean, I don't know, Olive, if there are more questions, I'm happy to answer a few more.
Okay. Thank you so much for Mbak Betty Indira. Do you have any more questions? Or we can move on to the next question.
Oh, I'm okay. I'm okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to raise a question.
Yeah, actually,
I've raised my hand.
we can have one more question from Mas Herianto Yang, and then another one. There is one more question that had been chosen by the committee. So after Mas Herianto Yang, I will read another one as well. So Mas Herianto Yang, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. With all that history in the past as so-called our capital, why do we fail today to drive the Southern narrative? I would say today, the Southern representation to drive the global narrative today would be China. Where does Indonesia fail? Where and when did Indonesia fail to capitalize on such an illustrious capital in the past, as beautifully written in your book? Why do you find Indonesia did fail to rise to the occasion? Now it's now driven by China.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really interesting question, Herianto, and I thank you for it. You're quite right. Indonesia was so in the spotlight in the late 1950s, and it seems as if it has not capitalized upon this. I think the reason is the change of regime in 1965. I think for Suharto, it was very hard to make himself visible with realizations that had been done by Sukarno. The independence, the Merdeka, the Bandung, the inspiration of a new global dynamic. This was not something that he could capitalize on because it was not his capital. It was Sukarno's capital. And so it was such a rupture that even Indonesians have forgotten about how international the country once was. I think now today it really could rekindle some of that energy. The first time I was in Jakarta, on the main avenues, there was this canvas on the 60th anniversary or the 50th anniversary of the Bandung conference. And there was like a new Bandung conference, but it was purely economic. So the whole political, cultural, journalistic dimension, it was like a G20, but with the Asian and African nations. So that for me showed what had happened to the heritage, to the capital of Bandung. The symbolic capital had become financial capital. It had been narrowed down to just money and business. And you're quite right. Indonesia could play a very visible role on the international scene, especially if you see last 2 or 3 years since the floods in Pakistan, the global south has been organizing itself against global warming coming from the north. And it's China, who is one of the biggest emitters today, who has put itself at the head of that platoon and saying, like, we're with the global south. And China is the biggest emitter today, but it's not the biggest emitter historically. So they side, like in Bandung, they side with Indonesia, with Pakistan, with other countries. But I think Indonesia has an own narrative to play. I think Indonesia is deeply affected. Its climate, its wildlife, its ecology, the livability, the heat you have to suffer in cities. It's also an argument where you could put yourself to the forefront. But perhaps I talk a lot to Indonesian diplomats. I admire them. They're absolutely. I was recently in Sweden for the Swedish translation of my book. I met the Indonesian ambassador in Sweden. Indonesian diplomacy is a very discreet diplomacy. There's the idea like we are trying to contribute, but there's what I see, and perhaps I'm not an expert on today's foreign policy by Indonesia, but it's more discreet diplomacy than front stage diplomacy, which is defendable, of course. But I think there is an argument for using the historic capital and turn it into an asset for today's diplomacy.
Thank you. Very much concurred. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mas Haryanto, for the question. There's another one question, David, from Brad Mates. David, I lived and worked in the Netherlands for many years in the 80s, 30 years after the Bandung Conference. I found it remarkable, even then, that young Dutch people in my age group, well-educated kids in their 20s or early 30s, either didn't know much about Indonesia or they did have superficial knowledge and believed implicitly that Indonesia was a rapidly emerging independent nation only because the Dutch had provided the capacity to allow it to be emergent. The attitudes of the returned colonists from 1945 had jumped to their grandchildren. The colony was long gone, but the attitudes were living on. In fact, were jumping generations. Have you observed this phenomenon?
Yeah, very classical phenomenon. The grandparents talk to the grandchildren and the grandchildren talk to the grandparents, but there's always a silent generation in the middle. I've seen it in Congo, I've seen it in Belgium, I've seen it in the Netherlands. It's a very classical phenomenon.
Okay, that's our final question for today. So thank you so much for the answer, David, and thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions. It's clear that there's a lot of interest and curiosity around the time we've discussed. We really appreciate your participation and engagement in the session. And as we draw this enriching discussion to a close, I would like to reflect on a key message from Revolusi. David writes about the idea that the Indonesian Revolution wasn't merely a fight for independence, but also a struggle for the recognition of countless lives that contributed to the nation's birth. This book reminds us that history is not just about the famous figures or the victors. It's about the silent, often forgotten voices that together shape the destiny of a nation. In a world where the past can sometimes feel distant, Revolusi brings history into sharp focus, reminding us that the narratives of our ancestors continue to influence our present and our future. As we move forward, may we carry with us the lessons of this profound period in history and let them guide us in shaping a more just and more equitable world. Thank you to David van Reybrouck for sharing your deep insights with us today, and to our panelists, Mbak Ayu Utami and Mbak Irine Gayatri, for their valuable contributions. And I hope this discussion has sparked new thoughts and reflections in all of you. With that, I will now hand the stage back to our MC to close the event. Thank you all for your participation and for making this discussion so engaging. Back to you, Mbak Tika.
Thank you, Kak Alif. Wow, that was an enlightening discussion. And I think, allow me to quote Mbak Putri, this discussion encouraged me to do my homework, to finish the book and read more about our history, about the Revolusi as well. Thank you so much, David, for sharing your insights, answering a lot of engaging questions. And thank you, especially Kak Olivia, for moderating the conversation so skillfully. And all participants for all the comments in the chat box, also for the discussion and questions. Before we wrap up, we encourage you to grab a copy of this book and enjoy 10% discount on periplus.com. You can find the link on the chat box. And we want to express our gratitude to all of you, our wonderful audience, especially for the participation and for the thoughtful questions. And as a token of appreciation, I'd like to announce the winner who get the referrals from Periplus. First of all, we have Rania Belva from Yogyakarta. Congratulations. And then we have Ervan Supradono. And we have Pak Cornelis Luhulima. Thank you so much. Kak Betty Indira, Pak Herianto Yang, and Brad Mitz. Congratulations. Our Periplus team will reach out to you further for the e-voucher. Right. So once again, thank you all for being a part of this event. We hope to see you at our future discussion. I'm Tika Widianitias, your host today. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pak David. Thank you, everyone. Olivia.
Thank you, Pak David.
Thank you.
Terima kasih
Have a
banyak.
nice holiday, David.
Thank you. Terima kasih banyak.
Hello.
Thank you, Periplus. I bought a lot of my books in your shops. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pak David.
Periplus for the
Can't wait for your next book.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Olive and Tika, for a great job. Thank you. Absolutely impressive. And thank you for finding Ayu and Irine.
Yeah.
Thank you. We will end this meeting in 3, 2,